if I know I have to turn 200 million into like 20 billion, it takes a mountain of discipline to not immediately jump to a million defensive design decisions of like, oh, we can't piss them off, we can't piss them off, and then you're just gonna end up with vanilla like by tomorrow. And so it's really counterproductive. The rare outcome that everyone wants, I think, is undermined by that same pressure, and that's unresolved. So like that's something I think like all of you in venture capital like can help figure out is like, you could be nice about it, whatever, but people know how it works, right? It's worked the same for like 30 or 40 years. So they're like, we're gonna swing for the fences, but everyone who says they're swinging for the fences makes the most conservative calls ever. And I'm like,
Hey everyone, welcome to the first episode of All Chat, a new podcast where we're aiming to deliver an unfiltered view behind the scenes of some of the most interesting and current topics within the gaming industry, startups more broadly, and venture capital. Joining us on our kickoff episode, we have Stephen Lim, founder of Raidbase, and most recently the creator and executive producer of Valorant at Riot Games, the #1 tactical shooter in the market and quickly becoming one of the most popular esports in the world. We also have Blake Robbins, an investor at Benchmark, a leading venture capital firm known for leading the Series A rounds of several of the most recent breakouts in games, including Discord, Riot Games, and That Game Company. Lastly, there's Brian and myself, co-founders of Patron, an early-stage venture firm with a focus on games and consumer startups. Prior to founding Patron, we helped to scale Riot from 0 to 1, joining the company before League of Legends launched and helping to build out publishing, esports, business, and corporate development as the company developed into one of the most valuable game companies in the world. Now let's dive headfirst into our first episode.
Yeah, so maybe we could start there. Talk about what it takes to create a great game. I think there's like a split between creating a team that's sub 10 people, and then you can also have like a AAA team. But yeah, I guess what are you guys seeing in the industry as it relates to like what does it actually take to create a very engaging game that gamers love?
I think we're seeing a lot of things work. I think before, like when I say before, okay, let's be specific. I think 25 years ago, there were just simple budget and tech limitations. That was like many obvious like hurdles in your face. So there was not a lot of money going around. Teams were, whether they liked it or not, were small, like 20 to 30 people back then. Tech was ultra limited, so that seemed like the holy grail thing to like overcome, graphics race and all that. Today, most of those things are not a problem. Like people are here to milk the gaming industry, so there's plenty of money around. Tech is relatively ubiquitous now because of Unreal and to some degree Unity. And small teams can do a lot. And underneath the tech made by those companies is like an ocean of tools made because of the store ecosystems and all this. And so almost there's a existing solution for almost everything you need. So a small team can do a lot more than it ever could. I don't think the indie teams or devs or mod teams ever went away. I think they've grown in. Well, actually, I don't even know if that's true. Like, they've been really influential this whole time. You think about, like, some of the biggest games we've loved forever, like CS, mod, Dota started as a mod. Like, these are some of the biggest games ever, so I don't even want to say they grew. I think we're more aware of them now, and there's more of them for sure. I love that there are both examples of these monumental efforts, like, the ones that like From Software makes, that Rockstar makes, Starfield and Bethesda. Many of those have died. I mean, we recently just saw Volition close. It's hard, I think, to make a profit. I mean, the games are still $60 for like 10 years. I don't think that's fair. And so, developers have had to get creative about like monetization, and then players both responded in both directions. They both engage more in them and spend a lot more, and also hate it, rightfully so. Like both are valid and both are happening. So I don't know. It's just like it's all over the place. It's just like the range is so great. There's many viable paths. That leads me to think like, why do it one way or the other? What does your game need? What is your team built for? And all that.
I think that's spot on. I think it's also like, not only did the tech get better, but actually distribution just got completely opened up, and that like you don't need, I don't know, 25 years ago it was like, who did you know at Kmart or Best Buy to distribute your games for you. And
one of my bosses at EA was he came from Clorox. And then it was like, what is he doing at EA? It's because he was really good at getting a box on a shelf.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so like even that, I think that was just such a major unlock on the indie side. Now, obviously, I mean, Steam, you just look at the top charts and, the number of companies or number of games that are there that is just a small handful of people that didn't raise any money is amazing. And then, you think about mobile in the same way of like, man, probably 99% of mobile games aren't venture backed. And it's just like, wow, these people are all figuring it out. Creates these weird dynamics on mobile and even on Steam of a paid game. I don't know, like BattleBit, which we were talking about before we started recording, but it's like BattleBit's $15, and that team of 3 or whatever is. I mean, they did very
economics
very well
are great.
Themselves. Yeah, but they grinded. They took a real bet on themselves. And
I mean, that's the same thing with Stardew Valley. Yeah. That guy, the story goes, he started doing that to make a demo because he couldn't get a job. Couch surf for literally like 7 years or something, and then now he made 250-300 mil. But I think he's still a one-man team. I don't think he hired a team. I can't tell that he did. I looked it up semi recently, and man, like
I think he partnered with someone to help get the mobile game out, but otherwise it's all. I mean, the game is still him. And then it's crazy, like Among Us, right? Like Among Us was also just like a team of 2 or 3, and it's like okay, wow, like some of the biggest games.
Valheim, 5 people.
Yeah, like that we talk about are just these really small teams, and I think it's only going to get crazier, right? Like I'm sure at some point we'll talk about AI and the role of all that in this. But like in theory, it should get even the quality of games should get even better with even fewer people, which is amazing. It just
I love
venture scale.
I mean, just such it's a nice to see that it's possible to have many, many things to point at, many, many recent things to point at. They're not few and far between. In fact, maybe the large gargantuan team thing are getting fewer and farther between. I think they've always been relatively sparse just because I don't think that's changed. I think we've just added all these other ones.
I think it's good for games. The industry has really grown a lot, right? Even in the last 10 years, you think about like internationally, how much players in like Asia, like specifically China, has like come into the market. I think one thing I want to ask you guys is like, it feels like there's almost like a bifurcation. You see a lot of the indie game devs and, a lot of these smaller teams being really successful, but on the AAA side or games that have like the lasting power, like the League of Legends or Valorant, any of these like Blizzard games as a service titles, generally require just like massive teams, and in a lot of ways, like they become these monopolies, right? It's not like you're going to play like one tactical. It's not like you're going to play like 3 tactical shooters at once. You might play 3 different types of indie games in like a very similar genre. But when it comes to these games as a service, it becomes monopolies. And I guess what's your take there? Like, I guess those are far and few between, but like, where do you think that side of the market evolves into? And I guess tied to that, like
which side, the indie side or the big side?
The big side, yeah, like the AAA, and a lot of these are like quote unquote VC backed companies. But what are you seeing? Like, how do you think that market plays out? Because it's clear, like the indie side is going to continue to grow, and that's kind of its own thing.
I think their toughest challenge is this like $60-$70 thing. Like people simultaneously feel bad about paying more, just even with the pace of inflation. And to be fair, like part of the reason I think that's the case and that why it's fair is if the bar keeps going up $100, $120, the barrier to entry is getting really, really high for the average family or the average kid. That means we're going to go back to the era, which I think this was the case, like, back in the 80s and 90s, where you get your like 2 games a year. So it stays really like hit driven. And so these games are hit or miss. So it used to be so regular that it was not even newsworthy that like a studio would die on their they could have 4 successful games and then die on the 5th because this is the economics just like don't work for it. We're all more sophisticated now and want to be more crafty about like hedging and padding for that. And it is really sad as the studios close. So there's kind of like, it's really rough in between. where again, like even like Volition, like such a respected studio for so long, can close, after like one or two like misses. They just don't have the padding, or that padding needs to be saved more responsibly. Maybe that's another thing to do. Again, with the tools being so good, like, do the teams need to be 400 people anymore, 500 people anymore? Like, they keep scaling as if the game will get better in proportion to the scale, but that's super not tied together, and everyone keeps running with that mantra. Like, I don't understand. Like GTA was like 12. GTA 5 was like 1,200 people or something. I don't know what that's counting. Like, if that's counting contractors and sub studios and whatever. But the next one's probably gonna be like 2,000 people. It's like they're not charging like $200 for a copy of the game. So like, it just puts them in a really rough position. Now they have the influence to like get good reviews by influence or by force or by good game, all of those things put together. Like, there's certain games that are like, Nintendo will never get a score less than 90 because who will dare to like diss them, right? So I think like Rockstar kind of has that also, but one way or the other, they like get those initial sales, and so they're able to continue it. But for the next like 20 studios that can't do that, like, they're just in a super rough spot. So
I mean, they might launch GTA RP as a service
rumor
with the 5M and all that stuff.
I would hope so, but I don't know that. I haven't seen any evidence that that's what they want to do.
Yeah.
I wish that they would do that, but if anything, I've heard like the people maintaining those servers, maintaining those World RP communities, get 0 out of Rockstar. So Rockstar doesn't seem to be exhibiting any of the behaviors to want to do that. They seem like, well, I mean, in a way, I both lament it, and also like in a way I admire, like, they know what they want to do, they know what they're good at, and they stay their lane. I respect that too. I do think it's a missed opportunity that maybe we can capitalize on, but or somebody should capitalize on. But yeah, it just like there's like a big disconnect that no one has resolved between the price of the game, expectations, and then also like the numbers that are actually required to make that content. The tools are so good these days. Like, with our tiny team, our environment team is like literally 4 people, like, from each of this one, like an artist, designer, and one engineer. What's the fourth one? I think we have 2 designers actually, placing stuff and thinking through the problem. But and you think back to WoW, WoW, like, everyone rightfully thinks like an MMO is like such like the daunting amount of content and all that. But WoW was shipped with 60 people. To be fair, like, I think it was a crazy grind for them for a couple of years, but they made a big world, very high quality throughout, and they set a lot of precedent, and they cleaned up a lot of things from EQ. Like, you can do a lot with a relatively small team, and especially the tools are even better these days.
But I think GT is a good example, right? Like, that's a type of game that's like probably impossible to go direct as like a venture funded startup. They just have like
I wouldn't dare personally.
Right?
There are some teams that want to go really big. Like Believer wants to go straight to really big, and they have the wherewithal to like to do that, and they have the force and the will to do it. I personally don't. I think it's too daunting personally, especially with venture backed. Like, I'm presuming like venture backed means you're expecting 100x. So you put in like 100 mil or 200 mil or whatever that costs. Like, it has to be like all or nothing. That doesn't seem to be right either. That's like crippling actually as an expectation to a team. Like, if I know I have to make, like, I have to turn 200 million into like 20 billion, it takes a mountain of discipline to not immediately jump to a million defensive design decisions of like, oh, we can't piss them off, and then you're just gonna end up with vanilla like by tomorrow. And so it's really counterproductive actually. So the very outcome I think is undermined. The very outcome that everyone wants, I think, is undermined by that same pressure, and that's unresolved. So like, that's something I think like, all of you in venture capital like can help figure out, is like, And you could be nice about it, whatever, but people know how it works, right? It's worked the same for like 30 or 40 years. So they're like, we're going to swing for the fences, but everyone who says they're swinging for the fences makes the most conservative calls ever. And I'm like, it's like these indie teams, like either because they don't know any better or they have the guts to do it or whatever, like they're the ones actually swinging for the fences. Like all these AAA, quote unquote AAA teams swinging for the fences are the most conservative. And the most bland and the most repetitive and the most like copycat. Like, none of them are doing anything exciting. I can't even think of one.
And Blake, you talked about this, right? At one point, I think it was like you tweeted about like VC-backed studios, and I guess just generally, like, what's your take there? Like, do you think studios are generally, tough to fund? And if you are funding it as a VC, like, what would you guys like think about in terms of like attributes and I guess
I was thinking about your initial question of like how the big players, I don't know how it ends for them within all of this, and on one end you have like the From softwares, you have really really polished, just crazy games that in let's put Rockstar and GTA in that as well, where they can justify maybe even $80, $90, $100 for their game just because people know and respect how good those games are going to be. I actually view them as like more in the movie realm of like, there's always the trope of like video game business is like the Hollywood business. I view like those giants as like they're playing a different game. Like they're going for their big budget, they're going for their big swing, and they know what they're doing, and they understand the risk. And there will probably always be a market for that. I think it ends up being only a few major studios really crush there. I think the indie side of this actually like competes more with that than like what I think of on the venture capital side, which is I think venture capital, at least today, for game studios works best on a free to play game that is a games as a service type model, and that actually makes sense to continue funding and like and can justify like, hey, I need $20 million to launch, and I need to like get the cycle going to really build out the pipeline of season 1, 2, battle pass, all the content within that. It's just a very different, the thing that we look at in games is just like games investing is such a broad term, but for at least benchmark, we're looking for a very narrow view of a studio, and more specifically trying to like actually figure out how they're going to break through. It's what is actually like their real unique insider belief of how they're going to break through. I think a lot of studios are building their dream game, and that's fine. But there's also like, it probably means their project didn't get greenlit within the studio they were in or something like that. And it's like, okay, what's like the deeper reasoning behind all these things?
I think there's something interesting. Is like, how do they break through, right? Because at the end of the day, I think as I mentioned before, like I think there's a lot of games that are building something that a lot of these large studios, especially in Asia, like in China, can easily replicate. And they actually have the IP, right? They have the distribution. It's easy for them to like basically build a clone. And I think like, with League of Legends, the Dota from League of Legends, that leap took years, right? And you think about the leap from H1Z1 to like PUBG and to Fortnite, like that was like super condensed. And in the case of Riot, I think this is public, but like Auto Chess to TFT was like literally like weeks, if not months. So like, I think that cycle of like having a small team and trying to go after these giants, like I think our fundamental beliefs, and we might be wrong here, but our fundamental belief is like you actually have to try to build something that these studios can't build themselves, and it's just really hard for them to copy. And maybe it's because you have some like insane game design that they're not going to take the creative risk on, and you can build like network effects around that, or you're building a game that just like is like a different paradigm, right? Like similar to how like League of Legends, when it launched, like people didn't even know what free to play was. Like that was associated with like games that were like really low quality, not AAA. Now, obviously, it's like it's flipped with like a lot of these games being just AAA quality now. But yeah, I guess that's like that's tough, right?
There's something that Blake brought up earlier too. I'm trying to recall. Like, there's a point that got me thinking. You were saying free to play. Where that makes a lot more sense, and generally a game as a service. I think that's maybe like a foot that's important to lead with. I've also think I've been observing too many studios prematurely committing to free to play. because free to play has the assumption that they are still in there 3 months, 6 months, 12 months in. And how many of those are there, period? Like of any game, even for the games that we just listed, like Valheim's and the Among Us and the and BattleBit, like we don't know what the legs are. Like you can pay $15 and have an awesome time for a month, and that's like super high value ROI. But that's not the same thing as I'm playing BattleBit 6 months from now in a free to play environment, and I've spent like my $60 or something, or whatever my LTV is, right?
Yeah. But you bring up the big question of like, can you even back as an investor? Can you back a premium game or a box good game that is the $60 model, and like that those returns on that are just fundamentally different because like it then becomes, even if it hits scale, let's say you hit $250-300 million on the game as a premium game, like that looks great and you're happy and you have cash hopefully and on the balance sheet, but like you get discounted on like, okay, you had a hit, can you make another hit? Like and it's just a different fundamental business than the typical software business that a creator or like a venture capitalist is typically backing. So that's the big question.
Maybe we're all talking ourselves out of venture backing games. Maybe this should maybe it was a nice fun experiment that shouldn't have happened.
Wrap it up. We're over.
Yeah.
We're
done, boys.
I think you can build like paid games that can become venture scale, right? Like PUBG started off as a paid game. Minecraft, like one of the most successful games, and even now it's still like selling copies. Like that's a paid game. So I think it's like the question is like, can it be a great games as a service? And I think it's fine to lead with a paid product. Like I think even at Riot, like, they were never like judicious about like, everything has to be free to play. It was more like what's going to create the best player experience. And I think if you could actually have a paid game where you get a lot of value for like $40-$50 up front, and then later on you have like optional cosmetic DLC, like, I think that could work. So I think
that's our general like assumption and approach right now is I'm not yet confident. Like we hope to have a game as a service. We are designing it as a service. I don't know how sticky it'll be at any given moment. I don't know what it'll be at a day one. I don't know what it'll be at month 6. And I think if we have something, and also I don't know what the heartbeat of the game will be. Like it could be that our game is intense enough that, because we want to crank it up a bit, the intensity level and the stakes for the initial audience. And it could be that works from a resonance standpoint, but is like fatiguing or something. Or like you just can't keep up that level of like pacing or excitement or investment. I often talk about this as like a reason to like rally like the boys to like, okay, we're going to like do a thing for like, it's like the excitement of like a new MMO or expansion launch, or like, okay, what's coming, the date's announced, and you're like prepping the wife, the kids, you're like, okay, I'm gonna like clear the deck for like 2 months, I'm gonna dive in, right? Dad's gonna be gone for a little bit, and that's me, like, so maybe like, other people in other situations don't have that problem, but like, but I do think you need to rally some amount of that energy, even in your own head, to keep that up, even if you love that kind of game. And so if it turns out our game is like really spiky for a month or something like that, and people had a great time, they're super looking forward to the next one, and it's successful from those angles, but it's not like we're forced to keep them in 3 months in, 4 months in, and coming up with all kinds of gimmicks that even like erode that kind of like impression or relationship, or undermines it for that next time, then I'm going to charge for it. I'm going to charge something for it. And then I think there's like a fair trade. And then we get to live another day to see that moment where maybe there are then like the 10 doors we can walk through that make it more and more appealing for a steady state. And we can like kind of gradually add that or evolve to that. Then I think we can open the door. We can always back into free to play. It's hard for me to think of an example of a game that started free to play and then charged for it. There's a few examples that are close, like Rust started off in EA charging $15, and I think they charge like $50 now or something. So they went that reverse way. So like, again, I'm glad to have all these examples. I think it just shows lots of different ways can work. I do think people need to be more thoughtful about what is right for their experience that they're going for, versus like pre-committing like we are going to be a free to play. Like, and then I always ask like, oh, why are you free to play? And it's always the same reasons, like, oh, lower better entry and all that. But I'm like, if no one's there in 3 months, like,
just because
like,
100 million people can play your game doesn't mean 100 million people will play your game. And so just trying to use the fact that it's free and it's possible as like the driver for that decision, which may or may not be best suited for the product. Because I think to Brian's point, you can have a paid model still be a service. Like you can have games as a service, and you can argue a lot of games that have seasonal battle passes, like there's a certain experience you have as a player having the battle pass, and then a very different experience if you don't have it. And so in that sense, it's almost like each time the new season rolls around, like you're paying to play that version of the game. And so I do think you should be able to decouple this idea of like being paid versus being free from whether you operate it as a service.
Yeah, I think Mitch has an old GDC talk. I think it's like 2012 or something crazy, and he actually talks about free to play being distribution innovation and not a business model innovation, and that he's like free to play actually isn't a business model, like because there's so many different ways to do free to play, and like I don't know, back then it was like freemium, actual like get the first 5 minutes type stuff that unlock the game. Like it's all I think it's better to think of free to play as that's the way you are going to reduce the barriers to entry and get a bunch of people to play, but how you actually monetize that. And you still see mobile games that are still very much pay to win that are technically free to play. Today we would be like, that's a pay to win game, but still technically accessible because it's free to play to start off. And I think that's the other piece that I think a lot of founders maybe forget is like there is a lot of this to unpack of how you actually like it might be that your game just monetizes with the whales and whatever else. It's just when you are a paid game, you're in theory capping your audience on some level, but if you're going after a hardcore audience, like totally makes sense, or like your niche very well, like go after it. But
you don't have to stay there, you could start there. Like,
I'm curious for you, Slim, like when you were at Riot and you're thinking about like, okay, we're developing a new game, was there ever a thought of like we would make a paid game, or you're just like, of course the ethos is like, no, we're a games as a service company and like this is what we should be leaning in on?
I think it's similar to now. I think both were possibilities that we deferred the decision on till later, until we kind of saw the engagement pattern, and it was like a rougher notion then. It's a little bit like evolved now, but still you can tell like I am just trying to keep my options open. I think it's a call we can make later on for the most part. There is something to be said about like thinking about it early enough to help it feel integrated or a natural part of the game versus like tacked on. I think I'm still within that window to defer it, I hope. And also there's something to be said. Well, we're far enough out. We're like still, I don't know, 2.5 years out. And so I think in that time, people's opinions can change about what they're open or not open to, what we're going to be compared against. I think all those need to be factored in because essentially that's managing expectations essentially. So so like, again, I think it's just pre-committing like 2-3 years out. You're just like, dude, the world's going to change so much by then. Like entire social platforms are going to come and go in that time. Like it's such a strange thing to pin against. It's a thing to pin against to me that seems relatively arbitrary, like early on. I don't think it's like that influential in the experience. It can be really influential in the response, but I don't think like we're really like designing the game around a model in our cases. I know there are some games where it's like super dependent on that model. Those are like I'm much less familiar with those, but in relative like multiplayer PvP game spaces, like it's it doesn't seem like it changes that much right now.
But I would say Blake mentioned kind of this R&D process within Riot, like living in the shadow of League of Legends, which grew to become the most played PC game. Like I'm just curious, like for I guess like everyone around the table here, like what was the expectation for Valorant as the game was in development, and then what do you think like went right? What do you think went wrong that allowed it to be kind of where it is today as one of the most played games in the world? More people play Valorant in some countries than they play League of Legends right now. So
so for I had a really wide ranging experience there. So my main stakeholder was Brandon. He's the one who like approved us to continue, and he and I had at most 30 minutes of conversation about business model for 7 years. So there's that reference point. And then there's like, I would do these polls like periodically, like when all the senior producers get together, I'm like, all right, guys, if Valorant or some of the other games in the process, like if we had 500,000 concurrent, do you guys think that'd be good? And I'd get all over the board. Some people are like, oh my God, it would be so dead. That'd be so lame. And other people are like, that'd be freaking amazing. Cause that's like literally at the time would have been double, triple, quadruple like the number one game on Steam. So it's like people's perspectives and expectations were all over the place. And that was the case throughout the entirety. Like really that whole decade of 2010s, it was all over the place. No one agreed on any of that stuff. So that left me in a position where it was both like daunting because there were enough people with like ridiculous expectations, and also freeing in that I didn't have to give a shit because there was like my main stakeholder didn't care, and also people couldn't agree anyway, so I could in a way like slip under the radar. So in a case like that, my brain goes to, I want to please someone somewhere, and it needs to be more than just me, basically, because we're not about to, even if it's not a directly a monetization thing, like we're not interested. We were not trying to waste a bunch of years of our lives developing a game that no one cares about. So out of a matter of even personal pride, like we want to resonate essentially. So I focused on resonant properties while letting go of specific numbers. So I'm like, this property should unlock or unblock this community, and this community is sitting next to this community. So I kind of like think of it as like spidering out by principle. And I couldn't tell you at any given time what the numbers would be. And I think anyone's guess would have been wrong. One of the things the thing I got the most criticism for throughout all of Valorant was, this is such a niche game. I got that all day long. This is too hardcore, such a niche game.
I remember that. I remember a lot of people were like, "Why aren't you building a battle royale?" Because like when Valorant was in development, everyone was, like PUBG and Fortnite was like really blowing up, and I think it was just like the bias is like, dude, you're building a game that's like 10, 20 years old. Like no one's gonna play Counter-Strike, right? And then
there's like Blood Red Ocean. I heard it all, and like but if you look at it from a lens of making a shooter period, you see a Blood Red Ocean. If you see it by the time you hit like mid 2010s, you have like 20 to 30 dead Overwatch like mimicking games. So like character based abilities. There's like already 20 of them or whatever that died. A bunch of them were high profile, and then you would say like you'd basically say that was like a limited opportunity. So, but we always saw it as a competitive game, and I think we have to take care about defining what competitive meant. Competitive did not mean esports. I think esports is a subset of competitive, but to me, competitive is somewhat simply defined as like you care about winning. There are a lot of games with winners and losers that you don't care. Like you could play a Call of Duty match, and whether you win or lose, whether you leave the match early, whether you join a match late, like the stakes are so low, like you don't really care.
Yeah, it's high stakes, competitive.
Yeah, it's like high stakes competitive. And if you look at it from that angle, there's only League. There technically was still like StarCraft. There's technically there was Counter-Strike, but Counter-Strike was like really steady state. Like CS 1.6 was like at the time like 75, 100,000 concurrent, and it was just staying there. Global Offensive was like third place. A lot of people don't remember. Global Offensive stayed 2 years at 25,000 concurrent. It was effectively dead, and many studios would have just given up on it. Valve kept it going and then consolidated, and it climbed into 400K by itself before Valorant came out. And so when I think about the criticism of Valorant appearing to be too niche at the time, everyone was saying like, look, you're going to split the pie with Counter-Strike, 100,000 players, like that's all there is. And then Counter-Strike grew to 400,000, and you're going to split the 400,000 player pie. Today, Valorant is like north of 1.5 million concurrent somewhere. I don't even know where it is. What it climbed to. Counter-Strike doubled since Valorant came out. It was around 450,000 at the time, and it's now over 1 million. And so the whole pie grew 5 to 6x. And I think there was like somewhat of a reawakening of, oh yeah, like we love competitive games. These games that play like a sport. There's a lot of people out there who with like that competitive sport mindset, and like they don't have a lot of alternative experiences out there for that, or companies that could deliver that well on it. There's plenty of offerings technically, but not many with the capability of Riot to actually deliver an like ecosystem and spend the money on expensive servers for anti-cheat and server frame rate and all the things that you need. So that means that there's very few like options for if you want that experience and you remembered you like that kind of experience, you're looking for it, you really only have like a few games to turn to. And so in that way, I was never surprised that that we would get a very positive response. Again, even while saying I don't know what that number is, could have been, it doesn't surprise me that that Counter-Strike and Valorant live concurrently. That part doesn't surprise me at all. I didn't know that they were each going to reach these numbers, and who knows what it becomes later also, and how long it lasts for. All those things I don't know. I don't know how they're going to maintain it. My head is not in that competitive space anymore. But yeah.
Was there ever a debate of using League IP, or was it always okay?
Brandon was up on my butt all the time about like, you sure you don't want to use the League IP? Because they invested a lot. So I think he's coming from a perspective that the company was investing so much into the League IP at the time, because they were developing Arcane and they were developing other genre games within League IP. So it was like, so he had a good point. It's like, you sure you like don't want to let this waste? And so I think the reason why it didn't make sense for us is I think if you're in League IP, there's some amount of expectation for melee. And or short range or projectile combat, and that's potentially viable. But I think it's a very different game. Like we were from the beginning, we wanted like hit scan and like really tight corners and that kind of thing. So that alone, I think, was to me a good reason to not use League IP for the sake of this particular game. But there's always been rumors about like a Dota themed shooter. And I don't know how that would feel like, but you can more easily imagine a Overwatch style action shooter kind of thing in that kind of IP. Yeah. And that's where I was like, usually it's funny that I'm saying all these things because I usually think like I underweighted IP. I'm not like an IP creative guy, so I for a long time I just felt like
gameplay was
essentially slap on like different IP. Yeah. And
Counter-Strike didn't really have like strong IP, right? Same thing with, I guess you can argue Fortnite. I mean, it's an IP, but it's not.
It's more like a playground for external IP to be able to blend in.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, and so I'm in more of that camp. Although, like in this particular case, I think IP does affect the gameplay, or the gameplay affects the IP.
And I would actually say, like, the fact that the benefit of League IP is everyone who is familiar with League would want to try it out because they could play these characters in a different way. The, I guess, unintended but now like realized benefit of having original IP is that they were able to create a different kind of theme and feel that appealed to you could argue, a much broader audience around the world that wasn't necessarily playing League, in love with League, and in love with like League's fantasy style. And I think one thing which was pretty effective as Valorant was launching was doing these regional cultural themed agents that launched with like specific music, specific art, specific animation, and it really made the game feel like it belonged to everyone around the world, as opposed to it was from Freljord or Demacia or some other unknown place. And then even now with like launching the maps and having the maps be based on recognizable parts of the world, I think is other ways to just make people feel like the game is like they're a part of the game.
That part was very intentional on our part. Like I think we wanted to connect. We hoped that the game would be a global competitive shooter. Like if anyone had the potential, we have to rewind a little bit. Like in 2013, every region had their own different shooter. So if anyone, I think, could make one that was popular globally, and I don't mean like big numbers of audience, I mean literally relevant in many regions, it would be Riot. So I don't think Valorant is what it is coming out of any number of other companies at all. Like I think it is specifically tailored to Riot, and Riot like is a specifically a good environment for Valorant for that reason. And to me, that was like the number one mission. That would have been my number one mission. If I was still there, I would have been like, we're not done until it's like relevant in the major regions, and then many regions beyond that. And of course, the big like elephant in the room was it wasn't released in China, and it took like whatever three years after launch for it to get approved. And it was really like kind of seemed like it was out of the blue, like that it finally got approved. But I'm glad for that. And then also the whole time we were watching like game metrics for Korea, and it was like it was probably the thing I was most surprised by, that we made a really competitive game that should have worked in Korea. It didn't. What happened? And I wasn't there to watch and see what happened, so I have like no details. Like, was the launch botched? Was it COVID? Was it like PC bombs? Was it like was it Vanguard? People refusing to install Vanguard in like PC bomb environments? I have like no idea. No real idea. And so we were really sad. I was really sad about that. I was like, did we mess something up, or is Korea like? Did the competitive audience in Korea age out and everyone's fucking casual right now? Like, I'm like, look at like Overwatch's been popular for like 7 years. Like,
it was all a ruse to allow North America to win a world championship. And now that that's happened, the game's gonna blow in both Korea and China, and then like North America is not gonna sniff another.
It's just done.
Is it doing well in Korea? How's
it's
it
like
doing
number
now?
3 in Korea right now.
It's still, I think there's.
It's been like this for like a year.
I mean, League is still number one
by
right?
a lot.
Yeah.
By far.
It's not
not
even close.
Yeah.
It's like 40.
It's still like close to 50%.
Well, Valorant bounces like number 3, 4, and 5 always change. Number 2s have been FIFA for a long time, but 3, 4, 5 they're all like within like a percent of each other. So depending on who's promoting what, they're always like bouncing around. But yeah, I've seen Valorant as high as like 9%, I think, of playtime, which is like pretty good. It's better than it was, because it was like not even on the list for the whole first year. So I was like, we freaking died in Korea. I was like,
I think having a vibrant esports scene that people care about is important in Korea. And now that all these like large organizations are investing,
I think that was,
and then China also
taking
like being able to take it more seriously with their local servers is going to make the whole region a lot more.
Although I don't know how to explain Overwatch still then, if that's the case. Sure. How do you explain Overwatch being popular in Korea for like 8 years or whatever? I'm like, was that a sign of the times? Like, is this next audience really like that casual? Should we all just pivot to casual games? Should we all making cozy games? Maybe that's why it's so popular. Maybe there is wisdom to that.
I guess.
Why don't we add farming to Overwatch and then we'll just call it a day?
What do you guys think about like boomer dad games versus like games that kids grow up playing today, right? Like, obviously like Roblox. I mean, we all grew up with like Counter-Strike and some of these PC stuff, but now you have a lot of kids and for them, like mobile is their native platform, right? A lot of them don't even play on PC. And in the States, it's obviously like consoles still like crushing it.
What do you picture when you say dad games?
Dad game is
what properties does it have?
Keyboard, mouse, like not like third person or first person camera. It could be like top down, like a lot of, it's like, I don't know, like it takes elements from RTS, Dota, like really long like session times.
League is a dad game, and then Mobile Legend Bang Bang is a
yeah. Or like World of Warcraft, I don't know. Like those games that we grew up with, right? StarCraft, like what's your guys' take? Is it really still like, do a lot of the younger gamers actually like become hardcore gamers? Because I've also heard that Diablo 4 isn't resonating well with like a younger audience, right? Like that game's selling really well with like older gamers, but not with the younger demographic, or they don't care as much about that IP. So
there's a lot of things like flying through my head in this like conversation. We hold certain things precious that they don't know. Like we've grown up with some of these IPs. To us, like Diablo 4 should be a big deal. They're looking at it fresh. Or just like they're looking at this thing with like blood and guts and whatever, and it's like, does it appeal to me today or not? Or the game, but like the game is gorgeous in its own way, but it's it also looks like many games that came before. Like if you just look at like I'm hitting this monster and and loot pops out, and you're already like drowning in games that are loot baiting you. It's not special. It doesn't look special or different in that way. So they don't have that attachment, and they don't see it with that premium, because they already have like 30 games like that on Roblox that are like loot baiting them, and like that are like that are already like loot pinata kind of games. And so if you look at it, I think if you think about it that way, the value prop isn't there. Even though the graphics, we would think they would care about graphics. My daughter defaults to Roblox despite being one of the few fourth and fifth graders that touched Valorant, Overwatch, Diablo 3, and like I know I'm responsible. I don't push any of these games on them. I just let it happen and to see what happens. And she doesn't give two shits about it. My boy doesn't care at all about games with better graphics. He does not care even a tiny bit. And apparently the bajillions of kids playing Roblox, they don't care. And so that all the more, like when I hear like what I call like dinosaur language out of developers that are like so still proud about like the graphics arms race and like their 400 person content teams, I'm like,
Yeah.
You haven't talked to a kid in
ever. Never.
Or you haven't been watching YouTube ever. Like you'd have to literally be, you'd have to have your head buried in the sand. And I think it goes to show like how many of our peers are not up to date. I try to be really hard to be up to date, and I know I know I'm very far behind, and like we're in a position, I think, to make these decisions, and we bear that responsibility, and we make these huge assumptions and leap off to spend other people's $100 million, and then we're all like surprised Pikachu face after, like, how come no one showed up to my awesome like next gen game made by my AAA world class team? And like no one cared. Like for the last 10 years, no one's cared. And yet we still like hang our hat on that. It's like so it's really outdated.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it ties into even the beginning of this conversation of it's why these small games like a BattleBit is breaking through. When
the game is fun. The game has features that Battlefield doesn't have. Yes. I love that 3 people are dancing circles around like Dice. Like Dice should have a fire under its ass. Like they have body drag in there, and all they do is pin the like chest bone to the knee bone of the other character, and you're like, I'm dragging a body. You don't spend like 8 months trying to get the reverse IK around the guy's shoulder and pull it. Like, no one needs that shit. Like, you just implement this in like 2 days, and it's like I'm dragging a body. Like, and your brain, our human brain's all relative. I think we just like normalize that. Like, you either vote to try it or not based on that initial impression, but once you're in, you re-normalize to that, and then that's your normal. And so when it's like supposed to be all high fidelity and it's not, it seems janky. But if you're already in and you just see the thing just ragdolling and like it's just funny and you don't care. So like I think we just forget like humans are like just relative. We're wired to be relative. Like there's something I love using as an example where to prove the point. Like most people have no concept about absolute numbers. So if you say how many days do you think a million seconds is? Do you guys know? You guys might already know this because I know you're all brainiacs. A million seconds is 11 days. Okay, 11 something days. How then, by that same kind of like language, like how long do you think a billion seconds is? We all know a billion is 1,000 of that, right? I don't want to give you too long to think about this because it's literally 1,000 times 11 days. But how long is that, right? It's 32 years. It's so different, right? But people are like a billion, they almost use it interchangeably. But we can all appreciate the difference between 11 days and 32 years because in our human lives, one is half your life and the other is next week, right? So it's like it just goes to show people can't appreciate hard numbers at all. I think we have to realize humans are like relative beings. So you need to just realize where you need to be relative to like an expectation and where you want to be like more than that. And I think when you don't have an accurate picture of that starting expectation, or you set a crazy expectation up front, which you do when you use the words like AAA team and from the makers of like whatever, like you're you're digging your own grave. I think you're like setting this crazy expectation that no one had at a time when you can't really deliver on it. And then again, we're all surprised, like, oh, it's like it didn't do well or did well. Like the language I hear that like Wild Rift didn't do well, I'm like, the thing made like more than $1 billion. Like, how? What universe do we live in where that sucks? Like, yeah, maybe it didn't do relative to expectations of like that we ourselves set. But does that mean it wasn't?
It's
like,
also trends over time.
Maybe
At a
yes,
point in
maybe no.
time, it could be disappointing, but it can become very undisappointing, like over a longer period of time. And so,
yeah, I mean, League didn't necessarily have like
League. The whole thing was like it took a long time to scale the user base over many years.
Many of these games could have a very different outcome if it had the chance to grow. But everyone wants that big initial splash so that they can post it on LinkedIn,
but
or like their websites, or
going
whatever.
Back to our original,
and they keep making these big ass bets.
Like League
for that
League raised like 15 million before we shipped, or probably less, like 10 million before we shipped the game. These other studios are raising like hundreds of millions of dollars before they launch the game. And so I think the expectation and the time you have to grow is also based on the expectation around what kind of funding you raised and how much the company's worth before you have a single player. But yeah.
I think like it's worth pausing to like reflect on like for each of us to reflect on what we're doing there. Like high score is not high score in the shortest period of time can really undermine the whole thing. Like a lot of these games were like grew over time. A lot of these huge, like even the Silicon Valley like winners, like many of them grew over time. And I think we need to pause to like remember that all this impatience to me, you can tell my bias. I'm like maybe on the other extreme, but like I think all this impatience directly undermines the very outcome we're all trying to chase.
Yeah. Well, I think game studios take a very long time for them to be successful. Maybe unless you're like riding on some crazy wave, like Riot did with like free to play and Twitch, and Supercell did with mobile. Like I think if you're building a lot of the traditional stuff like Epic, Larian, like these guys took like 20, 30 years, right, for them to like get to where
Larian, like I love Larian as an example. I don't know it super well because I didn't play those games very much and I don't know that space very well, but it's almost seemed like this elegant thread of like they were inspired, you know, by D&D stuff and Baldur's Gate. They made a better like modern version of that, and they like had to earn their stripes to actually earn the actual IP. Like it's such an awesome story. And then, you know, like I just was watching their the video they put out to announce that they got the D&D license like back in 2019, and they made some video that to me is kind of cheesy, but it's also like really endearing because it just shows like they don't give a fuck. They just like show their CEO literally dressed up in actual armor in that video. It's like so nerdy, but I actually super love it that he like loved to do that so much, you know, and rallied his own studio around it. Like, and it clearly worked. I mean, that game is like a love letter to that, and then the audience and the commercial response like was commensurate to that. Like that, to me, that's like the perfect scenario. Like it could not have gone like more perfectly, and I think there's so much to admire about that. But too many games these days are like, what's the business opportunity? What are the metrics? Okay, extraction is one of the few things, and then it's just like they back into it with their brains, and there's definitely many examples of that working. But I think when you only do that, you miss. I think there's something to be said for being immersed in that audience, because then you know the hundreds of tiny decisions you need that are also qualitative in addition to quantitative to build up that experience. Otherwise, you're like stunted. You had maybe a good framework, but not all the. You know, you put together this like clay human, and it's like it's fucking ugly. It's like at the end, you're like I knew what a human was supposed to look like: 2 arms, 2 legs. It's kind of there, but it's like this thing looks like shit. And it's like so many games. I think when you only do the brain part, it's just that it's like it looks kind of human, but it's like it's just not right, you know. And I think there's that people. I think because the qualitative part is so hard to measure and so hard to prove under the gun of like board meetings and quarterly updates, that people just like fall in this perpetual circular trap of like, you tell your stakeholders what they want to hear, you do all this, you ask your team to prep for that meeting, it's all quantitative, you show some pretty pictures to shore up the qualitative part, and then call it a day, and then everyone's happy and everyone pats each other on the back after the meeting, and then 2 years later you have
it's a VC backed game studio sim. You can just
yeah. Oh, I mean, it's not only. I don't think it says VC back. I think it's this exact same dynamic internal to the studio. It's just internal. It's the same thing. Yeah, and it again, there are winners in that approach, and I think by now the overwhelming evidence is it's a losing approach, like in the vast majority of cases, and yet we keep doing it. Why? We think we're so smart and so fancy. Why do smart, fancy people still keep making glaring mistakes? Like I'm just perplexed. I'm like, how do we keep doing this to ourselves? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if you guys have opinions on that. Like why?
Yeah, but on the flip side, I do think like there's gonna be. I remember when like Blizzard and WoW was like super successful. Like a lot of developers at the time said like there's never gonna be an online game as successful as WoW. People said the same thing about like EverQuest and all those things. Like I think at that point in time, it feels like things can't change, and there's like these entrenched players. But yeah, I think like when you think about even Riot story, how like Brandon and Mark were like straight out of USC more or less, and even like Supercell, like these kind of companies where it wasn't very obvious at the time, but they end up being different things. I think the takeaway for me after talking to you guys is just like it feels like it's going to be like those like less obvious companies that end up making it, or maybe like it's
look at what it's been like if you look at the team that made any of these things that we talked about, from Tarkov to Valheim to BattleBit, they're like a bunch of rando teams that weren't like from these storied studios. And then if you look at the other way too, how many of the like storied studios actually produce anything? Like you have 20 years of Blizzard to watch, and then you have 5 to 10 years of Riot to watch. I want it to work. Like I think all these teams are able to make a good game, but I think we get in our own way a lot of times, and make a lot of these counterproductive like decisions or behaviors, and something is off. It should work better than it is, and it hasn't been if you just look at the actual cases. And yet at the same time, like how if a lot of these innovations come from these teams that you cannot predict, how do we find them? Like, what do you think we should do to find them? Like the closest thing that I've seen be effective is what Valve's doing. Like they make an environment for them to come to them. They don't have to find them. They just like, they come to them and then they just filter, and they don't care that there's 2,900 games that die in a year for the 3 to make it, because they're just like agnostic about it. There is no studio that is equipped to take that many shots. Not even close. It 10 would be too much. So no, like that's another thing that was a big conversation throughout the 10 years of leading R&D at Riot. Was the thing I got the most was, why don't we take more shots on goal? Like we're too slow. We don't have enough shots in the pipe. How do I get my game started? And I'm like, we can't take enough shots. If you look at the stats of like which ones make it, it's so terrible. Like we're not gonna make 100 games for one to make it. Like we're not built to do that. There's not enough leaders. There's not enough programmers. Not enough artists. So it's a losing proposition to start. But you also can't do nothing. So like they had a point, but just not to, I think, to the degree it was like emphasized or weighted. So what now? Like what do we do? Like what shots do we take? How do we find these people? Like that's
but that's what VC is good for, right? Is it gives you, again, I think we talked about this. Like I don't think every game studio needs to be venture backed. In most cases they probably shouldn't be, but I think for companies that do want to try to build the next Riot or like these massive companies, why not? And I think it just depends on the product, what you're building. And it's also probably going to be like things that people aren't expecting, like products that just doesn't, on the surface level, doesn't seem like it's going to get there, but eventually ends up being like the next league, right? So
also most of them, examples we can think of, you can fish out of Minecraft mods.
Yeah, and maybe that's like the good digging ground.
I'm really surprised that most aren't doing it. Yeah, like I've been paying attention to it for a long time, but it doesn't seem like people realize how many of the games in the past decade, it's like almost all of them, except for Valorant and Overwatch, like almost all the games we've mentioned were born out of Minecraft mods. And people somehow still haven't like made that connection. Like Minecraft mod is like the breeding ground for like all this. Yeah. Or combinations of Minecraft mods also.